Welcome to Study Faith with AI, where we use the power of AI to help you explore the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
I'm Meg Jensen,
And I'm Paul Carter.
and we're Google AIs. Whether you're a lifelong member or just starting to learn about the church, we're here to dive deep into its history, beliefs, and culture.
So if you're ready to learn, you're in the right place.
That's right.
Let's get started. Okay, get ready for a deep dive because this one is packed. We've got some sources here about the LDS Church, specifically around faith crises and how history is presented, and wow.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It's a lot to dig into.
It is definitely complex stuff, but also super insightful. We've got this 2013 study about faith crises, an interview with an expert on the bite model, and a talk from a church leader about teaching history. So quite a bit to unpack.
Yeah, and it's like these sources are all kind of talking to each other, right?
Yeah.
Which I think makes it even more interesting for us. So let's jump into this 2013 study. It talks about a significant number of people experiencing these faith crises, and it even uses the term exodus,
Right.
which that's pretty intense.
It is pretty intense. And I think what's really striking is that it's not talking about people who are on the fringes of the church. This study's really highlighting that active, committed members, even those in leadership positions, are grappling with these issues. I think it really emphasizes that this is a much wider phenomenon than a lot of people realize.
Okay, so not just a few isolated cases here,
Yeah.
but what is actually causing these faith crises? The study mentions uncorrelated information quite a bit. What does that even mean?
Yeah, think of it like this. Imagine you've always known a particular version of a story, and then you stumble upon a different version, maybe with different characters or even like a different ending. That's kind of what uncorrelated information is like. It's information that kind of falls outside the traditional narrative that's presented by the church. And it can be really jarring, especially for people who have built their faith on that traditional narrative because it challenges, previously held beliefs.
So is this uncorrelated information, is this all just anti-Mormon stuff? Is that what we're talking about here?
That's a really great question, and it's important to address that head on. And I think these sources actually push back against that idea pretty strongly. Remember, this 2013 study was done by active members for church leaders, and they acknowledge that there are legitimate historical issues that can cause people to struggle. And it's not just, stuff that's made up or fabricated to attack the church.
So what are some examples of these historical issues that might cause someone to question their faith?
So the study specifically mentions things like polygamy, the translation of the Book of Abraham, and the church's historical stance on race and the priesthood. And these are complex topics. There are a lot of nuances to them that haven't always been openly discussed. And, the internet and social media have given people access to historical documents, different interpretations, and personal experiences that complicate those really simplified narratives that a lot of people might grown up with.
Okay, that makes sense. And you mentioned social media. The study also points to the internet and smartphones as contributing factors to these faith crises. Why is that?
It's not just access to information, but it's the constant and often unfiltered nature of that access, right? So imagine being bombarded with conflicting information all the time, especially about something as deeply personal as your faith. It can create this sense of cognitive dissonance that's like a mental tension or discomfort that comes from holding these conflicting beliefs.
Oh, that mental discomfort. Yeah, I think a lot of people can relate to that, especially
Yeah.
in today's world. And this study uses a specific example to illustrate this. Something about a young man named Adam.
Yes, Adam's story, it's so powerful. Adam's a lifelong member who encounters an ex-Mormon website on Facebook, and it triggers this whirlwind of doubt and questioning for him.
Oh.
And his experience really shows, and this is something the study highlights, how quickly and easily this information can spread and the significant impact that it can have. And it also raises a lot of questions about how we process information, especially when it challenges those deeply held beliefs that we have.
It's like that saying, you can't unring the bell. Like once you've been exposed to certain information, it's hard to just ignore it, right?
It is. And that brings us to this other concept, useful truth.
Yeah, useful truth. It's in a lot of your sources, isn't it?
Yeah.
What is that exactly?
Well, it's this idea that, some information, even if it's accurate, it might be presented selectively
Okay.
or even withheld altogether.
So even if it's true.
Right, because it could be harmful or disrupt belief. And what's fascinating is that this concept, it pops up in both the bite model, which we'll talk about, and the church's own discussions about, managing information. And it raises some ethical questions like, about transparency and who gets to control the narrative.
Yeah, because who gets to decide what's useful? And this brings us to the question of anti-Mormon content. Who decides what is and isn't anti-Mormon?
That's a crucial point. Yeah. Often the label, anti-Mormon is used to dismiss any information that challenges the official narrative, right? But who gets to define what that narrative is? And is it really anti-Mormon to simply ask difficult questions or present historical facts that might be uncomfortable?
Right. It seems like labeling something anti-Mormon can shut down any real discussion or exploration of those difficult questions.
Exactly, yeah. And it can create a culture of fear where people are afraid to even acknowledge the complexities, let alone discuss them openly.
So as individuals, like how do we even navigate all this? How do we know what's true, what's misinformation, especially when it comes to our faith, things that are really personal?
Well, I think that's where critical thinking becomes so important. We can't just blindly accept everything we hear, whether it's coming from the church or its critics. We have to evaluate sources, look for biases, look for evidence, and be willing to grapple with the complex stuff.
It sounds like we have to move beyond like that black and white view of truth, where everything's either pro or anti.
Absolutely. Nuance is key. We
Yeah.
need to understand context and be willing to hold multiple perspectives at the same time in tension. And I know that can be hard, especially when we're talking about things we deeply believe.
Hard work.
It is, but it can also be so rewarding.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop of institutional narratives and information control, and then these really personal individual experiences. So now let's bring in this BITE model that you've mentioned. I mean, it stands for behavior, information, thought, and emotional control. And wasn't this originally made to understand how cults work?
Right. So Stephen Hassan, who was actually a former member of the Unification Church, developed this model. And it's really to explain how cults exert influence. And the point is not to label everything as a cult.
Right.
But it does give you a way to see how groups, even those that are well-intentioned, can still exert control over people.
So how does this model connect to the church and what we're talking about with faith crises? Like, that's what I'm curious about.
Well, why don't we take a look at each part of the BITE model and see if it kind of resonates with what's in the report and these other sources.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Let's unpack it. Let's see what we can learn.
So behavior control, that's the B in BITE. And this is like how a group regulates what its members do, their actions, often through like really strict rules, expectations about how they should behave.
Okay, so how does that like play out in a religious context?
Well, think about things like dress codes or dietary rules, or even limitations on who you can hang out with,
Oh yeah, like social interactions.
Right. Or expectations around like how you spend your time, what you're reading, watching, even how you think.
Whoa, so it's not just outward stuff. It's like trying to control what's going on in your head too.
Exactly. And it's not always like in your face, This control, it can be subtle. It can be presented as a way to get closer to God or to be more spiritually pure.
Yeah, I can see how that connects with some of those personal stories.
Yeah.
People feeling guilty or ashamed that they're not good enough. Like they have to prove themselves all the time.
Yeah, exactly. And when those behaviors become like really ingrained, it's even harder to question things.
Right.
Even if you're like struggling inside.
It's like you're trapped in this cycle of, self-censorship almost.
Yeah.
You might have doubts, but you don't even let yourself think about them.
Right. And that leads us to the I, information control. This is where the group limits what information you have access to, especially stuff that contradicts their narrative or challenges their authority.
And we've already seen this with the church and the uncorrelated information,
Yeah.
right? It's like filtering, only giving you what they think is useful.
Exactly. They want to control the story, make you think there's only one right way to see things, and anything else is dangerous or a lie.
But then doesn't that ironically make those other viewpoints even more appealing, especially to people who are already starting to question?
It's like the forbidden fruit, right? The more you're told you can't have it, the more you want it.
Exactly.
And with the internet, it's almost impossible to control information anymore. People see so many perspectives.
So that might explain why the church is having such a hard time with this uncorrelated information.
Yeah, they can't just pretend it doesn't exist.
It's out there. So we've talked about behavior control, information control. What about thought control? That's the T.
Right. So this is about how groups try to manipulate the way you think.
Okay.
It's encouraging black and white thinking. discouraging you from being critical, from analyzing things, and really promoting this idea that you need the group for all the answers.
So it's not just what information you get, it's how you're allowed to think about it.
Exactly. They're creating a mental framework where doubt is weakness, questioning is disloyalty, and you shouldn't think for yourself.
And that connects back to the social excommunication idea. If you're scared to even say you have doubts,
Yeah.
you're probably not going to really explore them intellectually.
Right, and it can be so subtle, even the language they use. Like in church talks or lessons, there's a lot of emphasis on obedience, following the prophet, not going down rabbit holes.
We see things like, phrases like doubt your doubts
Right.
or the use of thought-stopping cliches.
Yeah, I've heard those.
And these can shut down critical thinking
Absolutely.
and discourage individuals from exploring challenging questions. Okay, and then finally there's E, emotional control. What does that even look like?
Yeah, this is how groups mess with your feelings. Guilt, shame, fear, anxiety, or like the opposite, this euphoria, feeling like you totally belong.
And we see this in the report too, right? With the guilt and shame about not being good enough, the fear of being kicked out of your community if you have doubts or you don't fit in.
Yeah, and it's powerful because we all want to be accepted, loved, to belong.
We can think about things like the emphasis on the fear of losing your salvation, losing your family relationships, losing your community standing.
If you leave or even question the church.
Right, and these are really powerful motivators to conform
Oh, absolutely.
and to avoid anything that might jeopardize your place within the community.
Yeah, it's a lot of pressure.
It is. It's a lot to carry. So after looking at this bite model, do you think it applies to the church? Like, are those elements there?
Well, we have to remember the bite model is a tool, not a label.
Okay.
It doesn't mean the church is a cult, but it does show us that these ways of influencing and controlling people, they can happen anywhere, even in groups that are trying to do good, like religious institutions.
So it's more about understanding the way it works, not judging.
Exactly. And I think we can see some of these things in the bite model, in what we've read, in these sources. There's some behavior control, information control, thought control, emotional control, even if it's not always on purpose or meant to be bad.
So we're not saying the church is evil, but these things are real,
Yeah,
and they affect people, especially those who are having these faith struggles.
exactly. And if we understand it, we can be more compassionate to ourselves and others who are going through this.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've talked about the narratives, useful truth, the bite model, and how all this can really hurt people emotionally. But let's get a little more specific. Some of your sources talk about certain historical events or teachings that have been really tough for people. Where do you see the biggest disconnect between the traditional story and what actually happened?
Well, the report itself doesn't go into a lot of detail about specific controversial things in church history, but it does say there are gaps between what they say officially and the facts. And these gaps can cause people to lose their faith.
Right, and they want the church to, be honest about those gaps, be more transparent about the difficult stuff in its past. But then we have Elder Packer's talk where he says not to put intellect above spiritual understanding. It's like those two things are pulling in different directions.
There's definitely a tension there. And I think that tension is there in how they deal with certain things. They have made some effort to be more open, like those essays on their website about polygamy and the priesthood ban. Those are tough topics. But some people say those essays don't go far enough, or they feel like the church is just trying to make excuses for what happened instead of really owning up to the hurt it caused.
So where do we see this disconnect the most? Like, what are some specific places where the church has changed the story or left things out or just not handled historical information well?
Well, one that comes up a lot in these personal stories is polygamy.
Polygamy.
There's this disconnect between how it's taught, like in Sunday school, this very cleaned up version, and then, how it actually happened, especially in the early days.
Right, like Joseph Smith marrying a lot of women, some who were already married to other men, some who were teenagers. You don't hear that in a lesson.
No, and they've acknowledged some of this in the essays, but for a lot of people, it's not enough. It still feels like they're trying to downplay the parts that are hard to deal with instead of really looking at how complex it was and how it affected women, families.
And it's not just the facts themselves, right? It's how they're presented.
Exactly.
It feels like they're picking and choosing what to focus on, like
Oh.
emphasizing the spiritual reasons for polygamy, but then kind of glossing over the details that are, well, more problematic.
Right, and that just creates this distrust. Like, what else are they not telling us? What are they minimizing? It makes it hard to square what they're saying with what actually happened.
Another one that comes up a lot, and the report kind of touches on this, is race and the priesthood.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. For over a century, Black members couldn't hold the priesthood or go to the temple, and that's a really painful part of church history, and it still affects Black members, their families today.
And they have said those old teachings were wrong, right? They say it was just prejudice, not revelation. But a lot of people feel like that's not enough. It's like a way to not take responsibility for what happened.
Right, it makes you wonder about about revelation, you know, prophetic authority. If they were so wrong about something so important, then can we trust the leaders now?
Yeah, that's a hard question. Gets to the heart of how we deal with faith when history is telling a different story.
Yeah. And it's not just about the past, you know, it's policies, teachings right now that some people have a problem with, things about LGBTQ people, gender roles, their stance on politics, social issues. It's causing a lot of people to really question, even reevaluate what they believe.
And those concerns, they clash with what the church says about obedience, following the teachings.
Yeah.
It puts people in a hard spot.
It does. They're trying to figure out how to live their own values and what
Yeah.
they believe and what the church expects of them. And that's where personal revelation is supposed to come in. Yeah.
Right.
They tell you to get your own confirmation.
Right.
But what happens when what you feel in your heart is different from what the church says?
That's a tough place to be. You're told to trust the prophet, but also to trust your own gut, your own spiritual feelings. So what happens when those two things don't match up?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And a lot of people are wrestling with this, often silently, feeling alone.
All right, so we've kind of explored this tension between, faith and facts and transparency and protecting belief. We've talked about specific historical issues that cause people to stumble, and we even touched on that bite model, that idea of control dynamics within the church.
Yeah.
But where do we go from here? How do we actually reconcile these seemingly conflicting pieces of the puzzle?
That's the heart of the matter, right? And I think the 2013 study offers some really insightful suggestions for how the church can respond to these faith crises in a way that promotes both honesty and belief.
So it's not just identifying the problem, it's actually offering potential solutions. What are some of those suggestions?
Yeah, one of the key recommendations is a shift towards greater transparency in teaching church history. So the study suggests that rather than kind of shying away from these difficult topics, the church should really embrace them, presenting a more complete and nuanced picture of its past.
That sounds a lot like what we were discussing earlier about moving beyond the useful truth and embracing a more comprehensive understanding of history, even the messy parts.
Exactly, yeah. And the study goes even further, suggesting that the church involve historians and scholars who aren't directly employed by the church, people who can kind of bring outside perspectives and expertise to the table.
That's pretty bold. It's like saying, we're not afraid to have our history scrutinized, even by those who might not share our beliefs.
It is a bold move, and it would certainly signal a willingness to engage in open and honest dialogue. The study also recommends openly publishing position papers on those controversial historical and doctrinal topics that we discussed, like polygamy and the Book of Abraham, acknowledging areas of uncertainty, and even presenting multiple viable viewpoints, even those that might make some people uncomfortable.
Wow. Admitting that there might not be simple black and white answers to every question, that's a real shift in approach, wouldn't it be?
It would be, and it reflects a humility that I think a lot of people, both inside and outside the church, are really longing for.
Right.
Acknowledging that we don't have all the answers, that there's still much to learn and understand, that our understanding of history and doctrine can even evolve over time. I think that's powerful.
It's like saying, we're on this journey together, and we're open to learning and growing along the way.
Precisely. And this idea of a journey of ongoing learning and discovery is really at the heart of the study's recommendations.
Okay.
It emphasizes the importance of creating a culture where doubt and questioning aren't seen as threats, but as opportunities for growth. So imagine if instead of viewing, those who question as sinners or apostates, we saw them as fellow travelers who are just seeking a deeper understanding.
That's a beautiful image. But how do we actually create that kind of culture? Does the study give any practical guidance on that?
It does, yeah. It It stresses the need for better training for leaders at all levels, equipping them to respond to faith crises with empathy and understanding, rather than judgment or dismissiveness. It encourages leaders to create spaces where members feel safe to express their doubts and struggles, openly and honestly.
So instead of shutting down conversations, actually leaning into them.
Exactly. And rather than just dismissing those uncorrelated sources that we talked about earlier, the study suggests actually engaging with them, providing resources that can help people wrestle with difficult information in a faith-affirming way. It's recognizing that those sources, even the critical ones, can actually play a valuable role in the faith journey.
That seemed to go against the grain of
Yeah.
what we often hear, which is to avoid anything that might challenge our beliefs.
Right.
It's like this study saying, no, engage with it, wrestle with it. Don't be afraid of the tough questions.
Yeah, that's a powerful message. And it gets to the core of what it means to have a mature and resilient faith. The study also suggests that the church should provide more support for those who are struggling, connecting them with resources and individuals who can help them navigate their doubts and kind of find answers that work for them.
So it's not just about providing information, but also about creating a supportive community where people feel seen and heard.
Exactly. It's about fostering a culture of compassion and understanding, recognizing that faith journeys are rarely linear or without their challenges.
It's like sometimes you need a guide, someone who's been through similar struggles and can help you find your way. And it seems like the church, with its vast resources and network of members, is uniquely positioned to provide that kind of support.
Yeah, you've hit on a really crucial point. The church has incredible potential to create a space where both faith and honest inquiry can flourish.
So how do we as individuals navigate these complexities? How do we reconcile those moments when historical or scientific evidence seems to contradict our spiritual witness?
That's a question each person has to grapple with on their own. But I think the sources you've shared offer some powerful insights.
Yeah.
One is that faith isn't about blind obedience or ignoring those difficult questions.
Right.
It's about engaging in this ongoing process of seeking truth, wrestling with complexity, and finding ways to live with uncertainty.
It seems like we're being encouraged to bring our whole selves to that process, our intellect, our experiences, and yes, even our doubts.
Absolutely, yeah. And perhaps the most important takeaway is this. True faith can withstand scrutiny. It can engage with intellectual inquiry. It can embrace complexity. In fact, I'd argue that wrestling with those tough questions can actually lead to a deeper, more resilient faith.
The leader we discussed earlier talked about judging the professions of man against the revealed word of the Lord. But could it also be about judging the revealed word of the Lord against the professions of man? Can historical analysis, scientific discovery, and personal experience inform and enrich our understanding of spiritual truths?
That's such a powerful question. And one that I think really pushes us to think beyond the frameworks that we're often presented with. It's acknowledging that the search for truth isn't a one-way street. Our understanding of spiritual truths can evolve and deepen as we engage with the world around us, including the insights offered by history, science, and even our own lived experiences.
So for someone listening who's been with us on this whole deep dive, what would you say is the most important thing to take away?
That they're not alone. A lot of people, inside and outside of the church, are struggling with these same things about faith, history, science, and trying to find truth. And it's okay to not know everything. It's okay to have doubts. It's okay to change your mind. What matters is you're honestly seeking truth and being true to yourself.
Yeah, that's so important. And, you don't have to go through this alone. There's help out there if you need it. Inside the church, outside the church.
Absolutely.
Books, podcasts, websites. There are support groups, even therapists, who specialize in helping people with this stuff. And don't be afraid to talk to, friends, family, people in your congregation who you trust, who can offer support and understanding.
Yeah, don't isolate yourself.
We've covered a lot, haven't we? We talked about how these institutions build their stories, how they control information, and what that does to individual faith. We looked at that bite model, how it might apply to the church. And we talked about some specific things from history that have made people question what they believe.
Yeah, it's been quite a deep dive.
This has been such a thought-provoking conversation. We've covered a lot of ground, but it feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
I know, right?
It's just the beginning.
That's the beauty of it, isn't it? There's always more to explore, more to learn, more to understand.
And to you, the listener, we leave you with this. How do you approach the complexities of faith and history? What role does intellectual inquiry play in your spiritual journey? Keep seeking, keep questioning, keep diving deep.
If you find value in this exploration, please like, share, follow, and consider becoming a subscriber. Your contributions help keep these conversations going and allows us to maintain the highest quality production. You can find all the details at studyfaithwithai.com. Thank you for being part of this journey.